Hello again and welcome to the 24 May 2019 edition of Portsmouth This Week. Our special guest today is Todd Drake, Portsmouth Wastewater Management. Welcome back to the show. I know you were on about 18 months ago and a lot has happened in that time.
Indeed.
And we're going to try to get through a lot of this stuff today. First, let me review your personal history, your background, and how you got into this job.
Okay. Well, had always been in electronics in various capacities over the years. In 2006, I was made aware of a position at a local company. Wasn't sure what these folks were doing, but I had heard that there was some sort of integration with computers and septic systems, which of course, you'd never put the two together.
That's right.
So I figured, let's find out about this. Talked to the owners of the company and liked what they had to say. And so in May of 2006, I started working for them as a service tech. About a year and a half later, they asked me to become their service manager. At the time, we had almost 1,000 septic systems in the state of Rhode Island that were under management by this company. By the time we got to about 2010, 2011, we had grown to a little over 2,500 systems and added on technicians and responsibilities. In the meantime, they had put me through coursework at URI, manufacturer training on pretty much every system that's currently available in the state of Rhode Island.
Yeah. Sounds like you're well qualified for the job. That's great.
Well, I try to be anyway.
Can we go over just at the beginning? Let's start and say why this town project of wastewater management was needed.
Well, basically pollution in the Sakonnet River and in the East Bay. The state in various offices does testing of beaches and storm sewer outfalls, shellfish beds, that sort of thing. And they were finding fecal coliforms and other pathogens in the water. And because they were finding it coming out of the sewer outfalls, the storm sewer outfalls, they figured, okay, there's illicit connections from old cesspools, proximity of old cesspools to the shoreline. Cesspools in general are known to be in the groundwater table, so just by virtue of their existence, those sort of things will find their way into those bodies of water. The state said you need to put in a municipal treatment plant to take care of some of these areas.
Sewage treatment plant.
Correct. For at least the areas known as Island Park, Portsmouth Park, and they were also thinking Common Fence would be part of that. And so there were a number of different engineering studies done. This town hired different engineering firms over the years, and they proposed different options for the town. Most of them very, very costly. What the town finally settled on was keeping septic systems and upgrading as necessary. So there was a memorandum of agreement that was reached by the state and the town where the town could keep using septic systems as long as cesspools were phased out, failing systems were phased out, and an inspection program was put together.
Yeah.
So
it's a long story, but
yeah,
it's kind of an interesting one. If this environmental problem is primarily at the northern end of the island around the water, why do we need everything else looked at and inspected?
Well, that was the assumption, was that was the only area that was polluting. And again, low-lying areas, high density of population,
yeah, we have a lot of
smaller
old
lots.
houses down in the south. So.
Right, and so what we're finding as we're moving through the inspection program, moving our way southward through town, is there are quite a few failed systems, old cesspools on some of those older properties. And even some of the newer ones that maybe weren't maintained properly have gone into failure. So distance to groundwater, again, is one of those sort of important factors for a septic system. And some of those systems that were put in and even into the 80s and 90s are actually impacting groundwater because of the accepted design practices at the time.
Yeah.
So
now this memorandum of understanding between the town, I guess, and DEM, what does that basically say? Well,
it basically says that the town will establish a wastewater management district, which is something that's in the Rhode Island general laws, that municipalities can establish one of these districts. And by doing that, they put together a wastewater management ordinance that outlines the inspection program, what happens if a system fails, where the phase out happens for certain things such as cesspools. So the agreement was that the town would take on all this work of inspections and overseeing all of this program, and in exchange for that, we would not be required to put in this very expensive municipal treatment plant.
Okay, so, and this was duly voted upon by our town council.
Correct.
And then I guess DEM agreed to it.
That's correct.
And yeah, I know these things could be very expensive, but we do live in an island, so.
Right.
Are all properties, both residential properties and say businesses, and are they all come under this agreement?
Yes, yeah, everything in town. So single-family homes, small businesses, strip malls, churches,
Everything.
the high school, everything in town.
Now, you call these like septic systems on-site wastewater treatment systems, right?
Correct.
Can you explain the different types and why we need different types?
Well, yeah, there are a number of different reasons, and the different types basically fall into three categories. One would be cesspools, and there are various types of cesspools, and those are not treatment of any.
Those are basically holes in the ground, maybe.
For all intents and purposes, that's all it is,
Yeah.
a hole in the ground. Next, we have what's known as conventional systems. Those are watertight tanks. They're connected to all of the sewers in the house. They are basically designed to trap solids and only release liquids. And there's a couple of different formats that those have gone through and changes over the years. Next in the chain is what's known as a distribution box, and that basically takes the liquid outflow from the tank and distributes it to the leaching trenches. There'll be 2, 4, 6, 8 trenches depending on the size
Now,
of the
what do
house.
those leaching trenches look like? Are they pipes or something going out?
Yeah, back in the late 60s, early 70s, you would typically find stone-lined trenches with a perforated pipe. They've since changed things, and the current state of the art is it's a kind of a woven plastic with a mesh fabric around
Yeah,
it.
that makes sense. It probably lasts forever too.
Right, and that's the idea. It'll last a lot longer,
Yeah.
can be replaced a lot easier if necessary. They can also be put in much closer to the ground surface than the old stone and pipe trenches. And what we found through research over the years is that there's a very good treatment activity going on in that top 2 feet or so of soil. So by placing things as high up as possible, you actually remove a lot of pathogens and other things without even having a treatment system. So then we move on to the treatment systems. Those are designed for areas where there's a very small lot, close proximity to any number of things. Your foundation, your neighbor's foundation, water lines out in the street, storm sewers, bodies of water, and also for very poor ground soil conditions where sometimes people think, well, I've got really sandy soils, it leaches really quick. That's not necessarily a good thing. You want some of that retention time in the soil to do that final polishing, removal of some of those pathogens.
Yeah, it kind of filters.
It does a final, cleaning of this.
Now, why were Island Park and Portsmouth Park specifically sort of pulled out to?
Well, again, high density, so smaller
Yeah, they
lots,
are.
lot of houses, and because of the smaller lots down there, you don't get separation to some of these things
Yeah.
that are
I
necessary.
think too the history. A lot of these were summer cottages.
Right, and a lot of them had cesspools up
Yeah.
until the last few years, and so by removing those cesspools, we can clean up the wastewater.
Okay, is there a distance from the water that requires a whole new system?
There are a lot of different specifications that DEM has put forth on that. Typically, if you are within 50 feet of the water, if there's no other space on your lot but to put whatever type of system within 50 feet, a lot of those lots end up with what's called a holding tank. Holding tank basically is just
Yeah.
a watertight tank.
That's a last ditch thing you can do.
Pretty much, because there's no leaching field of any sort, there's no treatment
It's got to
going
be
on.
pumped out all the time.
And depending on your monthly water usage, you may be pumping that every few weeks to every couple of months, depending if it's a seasonal property or whatnot. But further away from the water than that, you typically will find those treatment units. Sometimes, if there's a combination of issues, proximity to the water and maybe proximity to the fresh water line coming into the house, you may also find impervious barriers that are mandated, pipe sleeving around the water lines out in the street. Sometimes we even see ultraviolet disinfection units be mandated as part of one of these systems.
Yeah, well, now, I've seen these systems that basically are above ground,
Right.
but I guess they're like septic systems, right?
Right. So those are typically when you see that above ground component, a lot of people liken it to a giant kitty litter box because it's got pea stone in it and it looks basically like a giant kitty litter box. The reason those stick up out of the ground so far is because we're looking for separation distance to groundwater. The ones that you see closer to the ground, typically you'll find a 4 to 5 foot water table. Sometimes if you find something in the 2 to 3 foot area, you'll see those timber boxes sticking up, 1.5 feet, 2 feet out of the ground.
Yeah. So we don't really want a lot of tide changes going up.
No.
Because I assume that's where the water table comes from.
Exactly. So, well, the water table is affected by a number of factors. Down in the Island Park area, yes, the tides can have an effect on that because of the sandy soils. There's an old joke about some of the cesspools down in that area that come back in 5 or 6 hours when the tide goes out, and it'll be perfectly fine and clean.
Yeah. It's all gone.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So would you call those advanced treatment systems, the big ones?
Yes.
And I would imagine they're kind of expensive.
So a precursor to that bottomless sand filter is a treatment unit of some sort, and there are 5 different technologies that are currently approved by the state. There are a couple others that are undergoing approvals right now, but they all pretty much work towards the same goal, and that's promoting bacterial growth. And there are certain types of bacteria that feed on those pathogens and the nitrogen that we want to remove from wastewater before it's released out into the environment. Either through aeration or some other combination of chemistry, those things promote that bacterial growth.
Okay, so those advanced systems are primarily along the water or in low spots?
Well, primarily, but we do find them in other areas as well. High groundwater table, again, can affect that even on a larger lot. We've got some right now in the current inspection group, which is kind of up in the middle of the island, that are failing systems that are going to have to go to one of those advanced systems because the groundwater table is within 2 feet of the surface.
Yeah.
So we need to get that treatment done before we release that water out into the environment.
And that's what the result of inspections are to determine all this.
That's correct. That's correct. So the inspection program basically is to get people kind of in the mindset of periodic maintenance on their systems.
Now what determines the groundwater level? I mean, is it, for some reason, I assume that Island Park and Portsmouth Park had to do with the tides.
In that area, it might very well be part of that, but
or is the rest of it just runoff from underground?
It's underground runoff. It's storm melt in the winter. It's all kinds of things that play into it. And one of the things that they used to do for determining groundwater was they would just dig a hole. And a lot of times when a septic system was being designed, they would do those test holes in August or September because groundwater was at its lowest point. And so you could get that separation that you needed.
Yeah.
Now they look for what they call the seasonal high groundwater table. And they're telltale signs. When you dig one of those test holes, a soil evaluator will look at the types of soils and where the indicators are of that seasonal high groundwater table. And that is the part that they use for current designs, because they don't want to place any of those components in that seasonal high groundwater table.
Yeah, well, I know too that in those two places, the water table is pretty high. I mean, like you say, within a couple of feet.
Right. There are some lots in Island Park that it's within a foot of the surface. So. Yeah.
Never mind climate change. We don't want to worry about that.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about the requirements for the inspections and things. Let's start with the first one, which is basically what you're kind of going through with the rest of the town now, called the first maintenance inspection. What does this mean and how do you use it?
Okay. First maintenance inspection is exactly what it sounds like. It's the first one you're going to do. It's establishing a baseline. Your tank must be pumped as part of this inspection. And again, by pumping all the solids out of there, you're starting fresh, from scratch. Your pumper will make a recommendation as to when you might need to be pumped out. There's about a 3-page report that's put together for this first maintenance inspection. And some of the information that's gathered is the kind of history of the house. How old is the house? How old is the septic system? How many people live here? What are the solids levels right now today before I pump it? And they can use that information to gauge when you might need your next pump out. Follow-up inspections are every 5 years for conventional systems. Cesspools and systems with no DEM conformance documentation, those are every 2 years. So, but then with this first maintenance inspection, again, you're gathering all this data. It's kind of something that we can look back on if there is a problem with the system at some point down the road. They look at the condition of the concrete on the tank. Look for cracks. Look for root intrusion around the mid-seam of the tank or around the inlet or outlet pipes. They also look for, as they're pumping, they'll look for liquids to come back from the leaching field. Obviously, if there's liquids rushing back, it's indicative of a problem downstream that we want to investigate further. So,
now, what's a typical cost to the homeowner for that first maintenance inspection?
I've heard a range of prices.
Does it depend on the size of the lot or something? Or?
No, the inspectors are private contractors. They establish their own pricing and that sort of thing. So depending on who you call, the range typically runs from $225 to in the mid to high $300 range. That includes the pump out. Some inspectors are not pumpers, so they have to subcontract with one of the pumpers. And obviously those folks tend to be a little bit more expensive because their inspection fee is kind of set.
It's a separate fee, yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes they'll work it all into one price, but those typically end up, to the higher end of that spectrum.
Yeah. If these things, if they do an inspection like that and they find there's a problem, something's failing, or there's like you say, cracks in the tank. What is the next step?
Well, hopefully, if they find something like that, the homeowner is present and they can discuss that right off the bat with them. But I instituted a policy a little over a year ago that if a system looks like it's in a failure mode, to contact me immediately while you're still on the site. Let me know about it. I do my best to get right out there and
take a look and see.
Take a look. Second set of eyes on something. If the homeowner's there, I'd like to discuss possibly doing a second opinion follow-up test on the system, depending on what the failure point is. If nobody's home, if it's a weekend and they're doing an inspection and I'm not available, then we'll talk about it Monday. Next step then, when a system fails, is I print out a copy of the report, highlight the failure points, and then a letter is sent out to the homeowner, letting them know that this is what the conditions are.
Now, how often do you recommend pumping septic systems?
Well, pumping
intervals
vary
as well?
Yeah, it does vary. It varies on the size of the system, the size of the house, the number of people who are living there. A number of different agencies have put together charts to go by. I think if you talk to any pumper out there, they'll recommend between a 2 and a 3 year interval. But we've certainly seen houses, 1 or 2 occupants that can go 4, 5, 6, years.
Yeah.
And then obviously seasonal properties can, potentially go longer than that.
Now, if let's say somebody has their once a year or something, once every 2 years, they have their system pumped. Can the pumpers determine that there's a failure somewhere? In other words, every couple of years, is somebody kind of inspecting when they pump it out?
They typically will do an inspection, not necessarily report it as required by the first maintenance inspection program, but they're definitely looking at what's going on inside the tank as they pump it. They'll notice, again, root intrusion or mid-seam leaks, or we're finding a lot of the weep holes in some of the older septic tanks.
A lot of what, I'm sorry?
Weep holes.
Weep holes.
Basically, septic tanks are cast with a hole in the bottom of them, a very small hole. So while they're sitting on these manufacturers' lots, the rainwater doesn't collect, and you have a bunch of swimming pools, lying around that now you have to empty out before you can deliver them. The idea was that then once you deliver it to the site, those weep holes get patched and they don't leak anymore. Well, we're finding a lot that were never patched back in the 70s and 80s. So that's one of the recommendations I see a lot on these reports, is to fix the weep hole that's leaking.
Yeah, when these guys come in and they basically pump, and to pump usually you have to clear away the entrance, and what are they like? How can they tell that when they're pumping it that the thing's working okay, that it's going out to the leaching fields, that it isn't blocked up. I guess if it's blocked up, it would back up, right?
Well, potentially, and so that's why they're looking for water rushing back from the leaching field as they're pumping. The other thing they're looking for is on some of those earlier tanks, there are smaller walls cast into the interior of the tank at both the inlet and the outlet, and those are known as baffles. Those baffles can corrode over time. They can actually slough right off the side
Are
of the
those
tank.
concrete as well, the baffles?
Typically, they were concrete up until sometime in the 90s, and in the mid to late 90s, they switched over to using PVC tees at the inlet and the outlet, which you can actually put a filter on the outlet end of those tanks to further protect your leaching fields.
Yeah. Now, if I'm a homeowner, how would I know when I need my first maintenance inspection?
Well, letters go out from the town within a 60-day time frame before the actual due date per the first maintenance inspections. Otherwise, you can look for the information on the town's website. There is a wastewater management page that's available at the town's website that has a map and list of dates.
I think we're showing that on the screen right now.
Okay. So that map shows the various inspection zones, 1 through 18, and currently we're in inspection zone 12. So that
I wonder if you could point out on a map.
Absolutely. So inspection zone 12 is here, and again, it's kind of like in the middle of the right in the middle of the island, and we are finding some of those that are necessary to be going to those advanced treatment systems.
Now, and what's interesting to me is that it's not like you're just going from north to south. You're kind of moving around to different districts. Is there any logic to that? Like these are the worst ones we think, and
That's correct. So when the inspection program first started, the town planning office determined which were the most impacted areas. And again, Island Park and Portsmouth Park were kind of first. Then we went to Common Fence Point, and then, as you said, we're going to kind of jig-jog back and forth across the island, working our way towards the Middletown line.
yeah. Now, approximately how much of the town has already been inspected?
We're getting close to 50%. Of roughly 7,000 households, we're about halfway through at this point.
Now, the other thing is, who do the people that pump septic tanks need any particular qualifications, or how does someone get into that business, and what do they need?
Yeah, absolutely. So the pumpers are actually licensed by the state. Inspectors go through a certification program, and there is coursework at URI that everyone must take to become an inspector, not only here in town, but to be on the state list of inspectors.
Now, since we're about halfway through, are there any delays or waits in getting these things, or are they moving along fairly well?
They typically move along fairly well, but once we get to the end of that 60-day inspection period, things kind of bottle up a little bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes people will wait for the last minute. Sometimes an inspector who has an appointment scheduled might have to cancel because they had to run to an emergency pump out of some sort.
Sure.
So things do kind of stack up at the end of the inspection period. What I tell people is make an appointment anyway, even if it's after the inspection period. I do poll all of the inspectors periodically and say, who do you have on your list for afterwards? And I can update my system in order to not send out any notices of violation or anything like that.
Let's spend the next couple of minutes at least on the ordinance. The wastewater management district ordinance. When was this? You mentioned that it would happen over the last several years. When was this actually put into effect, and how can people take a look at it and read it?
Okay. The ordinance was ratified by Town Council in September of 2015. Again, based on the memorandum of agreement, the wheels started turning, and the town put together this ordinance, which was approved by the state, and Town Council voted on it and put it in place. Those first inspections actually started happening in October and November of 2015, so within a month or so,
Okay.
things started moving.
Now, what is the purpose of that ordinance? I've read it online. I think you have a great website, and it's pretty specific. It's got great definitions, for example, of things, but it also calls for some fairly strict regulations. So what is the real purpose and how is it used in the town?
Well, again, the basic idea of this program is to get people used to doing inspections. The ordinance lays out the groundwork for the inspection program, timing of when things will happen, also what happens if you find a failed system. There are also dates for replacement of cesspools, depending on locations, and like any other ordinance, there are ramifications if you don't abide by those specifics.
Sure. Now, if your system somehow fails one of these inspections, particularly the big one, what happens next?
Well, again, so a letter goes out from the town saying, your system has failed, and here's a copy of the report with some highlights on them. And the requirement at that point is that the property owner start the process of replacement by having a design done and submitted to DEM within 60 days. Sometimes during the year, 60 days just isn't doable. Designers are extremely busy, especially spring and summer. So what I do is I say to people, if you can have somebody under contract and I can confirm with them that they will be doing your design within a few weeks time frame of that 60-day period, no problem, no harm, no foul. I make all those notes and you just proceed from there.
Now, what if the homeowner doesn't agree with the findings? I mean, they can get a second opinion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I try to discuss with them as an inspector calls me out to the site. I offer a second opinion. You don't have to use that same inspector. Anybody else on the list is perfectly viable to do that. I always want to be present during that second opinion inspection. And a lot of times people already know when their system has been having issues, and so in most cases people don't question it.
Now, I assume there are penalties if people are told that their system has failed and they don't do anything about it. I mean, this is a law. It's got teeth.
Correct. So there is a municipal court system in the town of Portsmouth, and the ordinance has specific dates and times for notifications. And again, so that notice of violation, that initial one, when a system fails, goes out and gives you 60 days to apply to DEM. If I don't have any communication from somebody in that 60 days, none of the engineers call me and say, I'm working with so-and-so on such and such a street, then an additional notice of violation goes out. And basically that would say you have failed to apply to the state per the ordinance. That gives them another 30 days to comply.
Now, are we getting quite a few people going to court, actually?
Not a lot, to be honest. I think last month we only had 5 individuals in court, and some of those were people who had been there for a while who were kind of in the process of either designing a loan or getting an approval for a low interest loan, which are available for people in the town of Portsmouth to replace those systems. So it just sometimes takes some time.
We're almost out of time already, Todd, but 2 quick questions.
Sure.
If I was to buy a house in Portsmouth, what would I want to know about the septic system?
Most important thing is, does it have a certificate of conformance from the state?
Okay.
You also want to know when it's been serviced. Pumping records, that sort of thing are always valuable.
Now, can I sell my house if it has a failed system?
Well, technically you can sell it. There are a couple of different instances that might come up with regard to failed systems at the time of a sale. The requirement again is that somebody applies to DEM within 60 days of that failure notification.
Yeah.
If the failure comes right at that pre-purchase inspection, letters go out to the property owner, and then a reminder will go out to the buyer of that property. Sometimes I'll extend that 60 days to the buyer if necessary, but communication is the key.
We're out of time, Todd, but thanks so much. This has been very informative, I think.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. See you next time on Portsmouth This Week.